According to Mark Sandy and other witnesses, several facts emerged. First, the agencies learned that the president himself had directed the hold through OMB. Second, no justification or explanation was provided for the hold, despite repeated questions. Third, except for OMB, all agencies supported military aid because it was in the national security interest of the United States. And fourth, many were concerned that the hold was outright illegal. Ambassador Taylor learned of the hold on July 18th. He said, quote, the directive had come from the president to the chief of staff to OMB and that he, quote, sat in astonishment because one of the key pillars of our strong support for Ukraine was threatened. David Holmes, a diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, testified that he was shocked by the hold. Although there was initially some question as to whether the hold applied to DoD funds, which was already cleared by Congress, it soon became clear that the hold applied to all $391 million. Tim Morrison testified that DoD officials raised concerns at a meeting on July 23rd about whether it was, quote, actually legally permissible for the president to not allow for the disbursement of the funding. These concerns related to possible violations of the Impoundment Control Act, the law that gives the president the authority to delay or withhold funds only if Congress is notified of those intentions and approves the proposed action. Of course, neither of those things had been done. The issue was escalated quickly, and at a senior-level meeting on July 26th, OMB remained the lone voice for holding the aid. According to Tim Morrison, OMB said that President Trump was concerned about corruption in Ukraine. Cooper from DoD also attended the July meeting. She received no further understanding of what was meant by corruption. There was never a principals meeting convened on this issue, but there was a fourth and final interagency meeting on July 31st. Remember that date? A fourth and final one. There is a process for making sure that U.S. aid money makes it to the right place, to the right people. And Mr. Chief Justice, I do see a lot of members moving and taking a break. We would like to take a break at this time. I have another probably 15 minutes.
Oh, I think we can continue.
Okay.
If I may, what I was going to suggest was at 6:30, we take a 30-minute break for dinner.
Okay.
If that
Yes.
would work.
So break at 6:30? Yep, okay.
What I was going to suggest was a break for dinner at 6:30 for about 30 minutes. That work? Yeah.
Okay. So we know there was a hold, but there was no lawful way to implement that hold. So the OMB had to use creative methods. There is a process for making sure that U.S. aid money makes it to the right place, to the right people, a process that has been followed every year since Congress approved security assistance to Ukraine. The administration needed to find a creative way of getting around that process. Later in the evening of July 25th, the OMB found that way. Even though DoD had already notified Congress that the funds would be released, here is how it worked. First, OMB issued guidance asserting that there was an ongoing review of assistance, even though none of the witnesses who testified were aware of any review of assistance. Second, OMB also attempted to hide the hold in a series of technical footnotes and funding documents. And third, OMB's leadership also transferred responsibility for approving funding obligations from career civil servant Mark Sandy to a political appointee, Mark Duffy, someone with no relevant experience in this funding. Based on recent public reporting and documents DoD released under the Freedom of Information Act, we learned that on July 25th, approximately 90 minutes after President Trump's phone call with President Zelensky, Mr. Duffy put this three-pronged plan into motion when he sent an email to senior DoD officials, copying Sandy. The email is in front of you. In this email, Duffy stated, quote, "Based on guidance I have received and in light of the administration's plan to review assistance to Ukraine, please hold off on any additional DoD obligations of these funds pending direction from that process." Duffy also underscored, quote, "Given the sensitive nature of the request, I appreciate you keeping that information closely held to those who need to know to execute the direction." In other words, don't tell anybody about it. Later that day, Sandy approved and signed the first July 25th funding document, which delayed funding until August 5th. Sandy testified that the purpose of this and subsequent footnotes, quote, "was to preclude obligation for a limited period of time, but enable planning and casework to continue." Sandy also testified that his use of footnotes was unusual and that in his 12 years of OMB experience, he could, quote, "not recall another event like it." On July 29th, Duffy told Sandy he would no longer be responsible for approving the release of DoD Ukraine funding. This was only weeks after Sandy had raised questions about the legality of the president's hold. Duffy also revoked the authority for approving the release of the State Department funding from Sandy's colleague at OMB. In short, Duffy assumed approval authority for all $391 million of the assistance. Over the next several weeks, with Duffy in charge, OMB continued to issue funding documents that kept kicking the can down the road, supposedly to allow for an interagency process. And remember, an interagency process that had already wrapped up back in July. While inserting the whole time footnotes throughout the apportionment documents, stating that the delay wouldn't affect the program. And yet concerns continued to be relayed within DoD that it had. In total, OMB issued 9 of these documents between July 25th and September 10th. Even as OMB was implementing the president's hold, officials inside OMB advocated for the release of the funds. On August 7th, OMB staff sent a memo to Director Vaught, recommending removing the hold because the assistance was consistent with the national security strategy in terms of 1, supporting a stable, peaceful Europe, 2, the fact that the aid countered Russian aggression, and 3, that there was bipartisan support for the program. This meant that experts at every single relevant agency involved opposed the hold. By mid-August, DoD raised concerns that it might not be able to fully spend the DoD funds before the end of the fiscal year. Laura Cooper testified that DoD estimated $100 million of the aid was at risk of not getting to Ukraine. DoD concluded that it could no longer support OMB's claim that the footnotes, quote, this brief pause in obligations will not preclude DoD's timely execution of the final policy direction, end quote. Sandy testified that this sentence in the footnote was, quote, at the heart of that issue about ensuring that we don't run afoul of the Impoundment Control Act. Records produced in response to a FOIA lawsuit show that Mr. Duffy and Ms. McCusker exchanged emails on August 20th, and on that date, OMB modified the footnote. These emails are almost entirely redacted. However, all the subsequent footnotes issued by OMB during the pendency of the hold removed the sentence regarding DoD's ability to fully obligate the funds by the end of the fiscal year. Nevertheless, OMB continued to implement the hold at the president's direction. We know from emails released last night that as of September 5th, OMB was continuing to instruct DoD to hold the aid. OMB gave these emails to a private organization just because of a FOIA lawsuit. On September 5th, Duffy emailed McCusker the following, quote, no movement from Ukraine. Footnote forthcoming to continue hold through Friday, end quote. We know that McCusker responded to OMB with a lengthy email detailing DoD's serious concerns, but OMB redacted almost the whole thing. As I explained last night, OMB has key documents that President Trump has refused to turn over to Congress. Key documents that go to the heart of one of the ways in which the president abused his power. Concerns about whether the administration was bending, if not breaking the law, contributed to at least 2 OMB officials resigning, including an attorney in OMB. According to Sandy, one colleague specifically disagreed with OMB General Counsel about the application of the Impoundment Control Act. As I mentioned earlier, the Independent and Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office has already said that the hold was illegal. But you remember the OMB correspondence referencing the, quote, interagency process. As we now know, there was no interagency process. It had ended months before. They made it up. They had to make it up because they couldn't say the real reason for the hold. Sometime prior to August 16th, Ambassador Bolton had a one-on-one meeting with President Trump. According to Morrison, at that meeting, the president, quote, was not ready to approve the release of the assistance. Ambassador Bolton instructed Morrison to look for other opportunities to get the president's cabinet together to, quote, have the direct, in-person conversation with the president about this topic. Everyone was worried, including the president's national security advisor. In mid-August, Colonel Vidman drafted a presidential decision memorandum for Ambassador Bolton to present to President Trump for a decision on Ukraine security assistance. The memorandum recommended that the hold be lifted. Morrison testified that the memorandum was never provided to the president because of other competing issues. Morrison testified that a meeting with the president was never arranged in August, reportedly because of scheduling problems. According to recent press reports, on August 30th, Secretary of Defense Esper, Secretary of State Pompeo met with President Trump and implored him to release the security assistance because doing so was in the interests of the United States. However, President Trump continued to ignore everybody. Later that day, Duffy emailed Undersecretary of Defense Elaine McCusker and wrote, quote, clear direction from POTUS to hold. The Ukrainian government knew of President Trump's hold on security assistance well before it was publicly reported on August 28th. This was not surprising. U.S. diplomat Catherine Croft testified it was, quote, inevitable that it was eventually going to come out. She said 2 individuals from the Ukrainian embassy here in Washington approached her approximately a week apart, quote, quietly and in confidence, to ask me about an OMB hold on Ukraine security assistance. She could not precisely recall the dates of these conversations, but testified that she was, quote, very surprised at the effectiveness of my Ukrainian counterparts. Everyone was worried. So why would these diplomats quietly make this inquiry? It's because if it had gone public, it would show that weakness against Russia that was so concerning to everybody involved. She said, quote, I think that if this were public in Ukraine, it would be seen as a reversal of our policy. It would be a really big deal in Ukraine and an expression of declining U.S. support for Ukraine. Meanwhile, Laura Cooper testified that DOD heard from the Ukrainian embassy on July 25th, the same day as President Trump's call to President Zelensky.
On July 25th, a member of my staff got a question from a Ukraine embassy contact asking what was going on with Ukraine security assistance. Because at that time, we did not know what the guidance was on USAI. The OMB notice of apportionment arrived that day, but this staff member did not find out about it until later. I was informed that the staff member told the Ukrainian official that we were moving forward on USAI, but recommended that the Ukraine embassy check in with state regarding the FMF.
USAI referred to the $250 million that OMB blocked DOD from sending to Ukraine. FMF referred to the $141 million that they blocked from the State Department. On July 25th, Cooper's staff also received 2 emails from the State Department revealing that the Ukrainian embassy was, quote, asking about security assistance, and that the Hill knows about the FMF situation to an extent, and so does the Ukrainian embassy. One of Cooper's staff members reported additional contacts with Ukrainian officials about the hold in August. Finally, we know the Ukrainians knew about the hold because the New York Times published an interview with the former Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Elena Zirkle. She stated that she and President Zelensky's office received a cable in late July informing them of the hold. In short, by the time of Politico's report on August 28th, the Ukrainians were well aware that the aid was not only important, was not the only important official act that the White House was withholding from them. The long-sought White House visit for President Zelensky was also in limbo. As all of this transpired, Ukrainian troops were still on the front lines in eastern Ukraine, facing off against Russian-backed forces, dying in defense of their country. Ambassador Bill Taylor visited those Ukrainian troops on July 26. He recalled seeing, quote, the armed and hostile Russian-led force on the other side of the damaged bridge across the line of the contact. When asked to reflect on that visit, here is what Ambassador Taylor had to say.
Let's talk about July 26th, a lot of years later. You go to the front, you go to Donbass with Ambassador Volker, I believe, and you're on the bridge and you're looking over on the front line at the Russian soldiers. Is that what you recalled?
Yes, sir.
And you said the commander there, the Ukrainian commander, thanked you for the American military assistance that you knew was being withheld at that moment.
That's correct.
How'd that make you feel, sir?
Badly.
Why?
Because it was clear that that commander counted on us. It was clear that that commander had confidence in us. It was clear that that commander was appreciative of the capabilities that he was given by that assistance, but also the reassurance that we were supporting him.
Like me, Ambassador Taylor is a combat veteran. In fact, he was awarded a Bronze Star. Ambassador Taylor knew how vital our military aid was to those Ukrainian troops because he knows what it feels like to have people counting on you. Members of the U.S. Senate, I know you believe that aid is important too, because 87 members of this body voted to support it. President Trump did not think the aid was important last year. He ignored you and the direction of Congress. He betrayed the confidence of our Ukrainian partners and U.S. national security when he corruptly withheld that aid. And he did so because he simply wanted to help his own political campaign. Our men and women in uniform deserve better. Our friends and allies deserve better. The American people deserve better.
Chief Justice Roberts, Senators, and Counsel for the President. Now I want to talk to you about the White House meeting that President Trump offered to President Zelensky during their first phone call in April. But as you know, that meeting has not been scheduled. It was never scheduled. Ambassador Sondland testified that after the May 23rd meeting with President Trump, it became clear that President Zelensky would not be invited to the Oval Office until he announced the opening of investigations that would benefit President Trump's re-election. During his testimony, Ambassador Sondland stressed that it was a clear quid pro quo. Let's listen.
I know that members of this committee frequently frame these complicated issues in the form of a simple question. Was there a quid pro quo? As I testified previously, With regard to the requested White House call and the White House meeting, the answer is yes. Mr. Giuliani conveyed to Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, and others that President Trump wanted a public statement from President Zelensky committing to investigations of Burisma and the 2016 election. Mr. Giuliani expressed those requests directly to the Ukrainians, and Mr. Giuliani also expressed those requests directly to us. We all understood that these prerequisites for the White House call and the White House meeting reflected President Trump's desires and requirements.
Ambassador Sondland also testified that the scheme to pressure Ukraine into fulfilling the president's requirements for an Oval Office meeting became progressively and more specific and problematic, what he described as a continuum of insidiousness. He explained the evolution from generic requests to investigate corruption to calls to pursue specific allegations against President Trump's political opponents. Here is Ambassador Sondland again.
Well, Mr. Chairman, when we left the Oval Office, I believe on May 23rd, the request was very generic for an investigation of corruption in a very vanilla sense, and dealing with some of the oligarch problems in Ukraine, which were longstanding problems. And then as time went on, more specific items got added to the menu, including the Burisma and 2016 election meddling specifically, the DNC server specifically. And over this continuum, it became more and more difficult to secure the White House meeting because more conditions were being placed on the White House meeting.
In short, Ambassadors Volker and Sondland understood that to get the meeting scheduled, they needed to get Mr. Giuliani's agreement first. On June 27, Ambassador Sondland explained to Ambassador Taylor that President Trump needed to hear from the Ukrainian leader before he would consent to a White House meeting. Here is how Ambassador Taylor explained it.
On June 27th, Ambassador Sondland told me during a phone conversation that President Zelensky needed to make clear to President Trump that he, President Zelensky, was not standing in the way of investigations.
Diplomat David Holmes testified that he understood early on the investigations to mean the Burisma Biden investigations that Mr. Giuliani and his associates had been speaking about publicly. Mr. Holmes noted that while President Trump was withholding an Oval meeting with Ukraine's newly elected leader, he agreed to meet with Ukraine's chief foe, Vladimir Putin. Mr. Holmes had this to say.
Also on June 28th, while President Trump was still not moving forward on a meeting with President Zelensky, he met with Russian President Putin at the G20 summit in Osaka, Japan, sending a further signal of lack of support to Ukraine.
Ambassador Volker did not dispute other witnesses' testimony that President Trump conditioned Oval Office meetings on President Zelensky's willingness to announce investigations. Indeed, Ambassador Volker helped matters along. Ambassador Volker testified that at a conference in early July, he suggested that President Zelensky speak to President Trump on the phone to discuss the investigations. During his testimony, Ambassador Volker described that encounter.
And in the July 2nd or 3rd meeting in Toronto that you had with President Zelensky, you also mentioned investigations to him,
Yes.
right? And again, you were referring to the Burisma.
I was thinking
and
of
the 2016.
Burisma in 2016.
Okay. And you understood that that's what the Ukrainians interpreted references to investigations to be related to Burisma and the 2016 election.
I don't know specifically at that time if we had talked to that specifically, Burisma 2016 with President Zelensky. That was my assumption, though, that they would have been thinking that too.
Mr. Giuliani became an inescapable presence to both Ukrainian officials and American diplomats. To the Ukrainians, Rudy Giuliani was seen as both a potential channel to President Trump and an obstacle to a productive U.S.-Ukraine relationship. A top aide to President Zelensky texts to Volker that, "I feel that the key for many things is Rudy, and I'm ready to talk with him at any time." But everyone understood that Mr. Giuliani was no rogue agent. He was acting at the direction of the president. Ambassador Sondland clearly described Mr. Giuliani's role in regard to the president. Let's listen.
Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing the investigations of the 2016 election, DNC server, and Burisma. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew these investigations were important to the President.
Concerned about Mr. Giuliani's influence began to grow. On July 10th, at a meeting between Ambassador Taylor and two Ukrainian officials in Kyiv, Ukrainian officials said they were very concerned because Mr. Giuliani had told the corrupt Prosecutor General Lysenko that President Trump would not meet with the Ukrainian leader. Back in Washington, two important encounters at the White House further revealed the existence of a corrupt quid pro quo. Ambassador Sondland first broached the investigation in a meeting in Ambassador Bolton's office with Bolton's Ukrainian counterpart and President Zelensky's top aide. Also present were Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, and NSC officials Dr. Hill and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. Toward the end of the meeting, the Ukrainians raised the topic of an Oval Office meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky. Ambassador Bolton started to respond when Ambassador Sondland interjected and raised the demands of the investigation. Here is how Lieutenant Colonel Vindman recalled the conversation.
To the best of my recollection, Ambassador Sondland said that in order to get a White House meeting, the Ukrainians would have to provide a deliverable, which is investigations, specific investigations.
Ambassador Volker separately confirmed this recollection during his testimony.
I participated in the July 10th meeting between National Security Advisor Bolton and then Ukrainian Chairman of the National Security and Defense Council, Alex Danylyuk. As I remember, the meeting was essentially over when Ambassador Sondland made a general comment about investigations. I think all of us thought it was inappropriate.
Ambassador Bolton also found Ambassador Sondland's reference to be inappropriate, and he abruptly ended the meeting. However, Ambassador Sondland was not deterred. He convened a second meeting where he discussed what needed to happen before an Oval Office meeting. Apparently, Ambassador Sondland had received his marching orders from the president, and he was determined to carry them out. Bolton sent Dr. Hill to join that meeting and report back, and this is what Dr. Hill had to say.
And so when I came in, Gordon Sondland was basically saying, well, look, we have a deal here that there will be a meeting. I have a deal here with Chief of Staff Mulvaney. There will be a meeting if the Ukrainians open up or announce these investigations into 2016 in Burisma. And I cut it off immediately there. Because by this point, having heard Mr. Giuliani, over and over again on the television and all of the issues that he was asserting. By this point, it was clear that Burisma was code for the Bidens because Giuliani was laying it out there.
After the meeting, Dr. Hill followed up with Ambassador Bolton and relayed what transpired. Bolton was alarmed. In other words, Ambassador Bolton didn't want any part of it. He directed Dr. Hill to brief the NSC's top attorney, John Eisenberg, as she explained during her hearing.
What was that
Question that you're
specific
asking.
instruction?
So the specific instruction was that I had to go to the lawyers, to John Eisenberg, our senior counsel for the National Security Council, to basically say, you tell Eisenberg, Ambassador Bolton told me, that I am not part of this whatever drug deal that Mulvaney and Sondland are cooking up.
What did you understand him to mean by the drug deal that Mulvaney and Sondland were cooking up?
I took it to mean investigations for a meeting.
Did you go speak to the lawyers?
I certainly did.
Senators, as a former chief of police, I think it's quite interesting that Ambassador Bolton categorized the corrupt scheme, the pressure campaign, as a, quote, drug deal. I think that Ambassador Bolton was trying to send us a very powerful message. A message that not only would the lawyers, the top lawyer, understand, but that every person would understand. Every member of the House, every member of the Senate, every member of our great country, every citizen. And Ambassador Bolton also wanted to make clear, especially to the top attorney, that he did not want to have anything to do with a drug deal in progress. But we do know. We know now, of course, that Ambassador Bolton can testify directly about this. He can testify directly for himself about this meeting if he appears before this body, as he has indicated that he is prepared to do if this body is willing to issue a subpoena. We need to hear from Ambassador Bolton, and I know the American people want to hear from Ambassador Bolton as well. Dr. Hill testified that she spoke to Mr. Eisenberg twice. Dr. Hill also indicated that Mr. Eisenberg took notes of their meeting, which we, to no surprise now, we have not received because of the president's obstruction. It's clear Ambassador Sondland was not operating a rogue operation. He testified that everyone was in the loop. Let's listen once again.
Everyone was in the loop. It was no secret. Everyone was informed via email on July 19th, days before the presidential call. As I communicated to the team, I told President Zelensky in advance that assurances to run a fully transparent investigation and turn over every stone were necessary in his call with President Trump.
In the email referenced, Ambassador Sondland wrote the following to Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Perry, and Mr. Mulvaney regarding President Zelensky. He is prepared to receive POTUS's call. We'll assure him that he intends to run a fully transparent investigation and will turn over every stone. Both Mulvaney and Perry responded to the email noting that the head of state call would be scheduled right away. Now, you may be asking, what did Mulvaney know about these investigations? And did he have any conversations with President Trump about them? Senators, this body is entitled to see all of the evidence. And you know what? The American people are entitled to hear all of the evidence. And while the nature of the drug deal we've talked about was uncontested, it is important for the country to know that everyone was involved. Because we've heard it, everyone was in the loop. Now, later that day, July 19th, Ambassador Sondland texted Ambassadors Volker and Taylor about the upcoming head of state telephone call. And the text said, "Looks like POTUS call tomorrow." I spoke directly to Zelensky and gave him a full briefing. He's got it. Ambassador Volker replied to Sondland's text, "Most important is for Zelensky to say that he will help investigations." The evidence shows that the Ukrainians understood what they needed to do to earn a White House meeting with the president. On July 20th, the day after Ambassador Sondland's phone call with President Zelensky, Ambassador Taylor spoke with the Ukrainian National Security Advisor. Ukraine's National Security Advisor conveyed that the Ukrainian president did not want to become an instrument in U.S. politics. Here is how Ambassador Taylor explained that concern.
What did you understand it to mean when that Zelensky had concerns about being an instrument in Washington domestic re-election politics?
Mr. Daniluk understood that these investigations were pursuant to Mr. Giuliani's request to develop information, to find information about Burisma and the Bidens. This was very well known in public. Mr. Giuliani had made this point clear in several instances in the beginning, in the springtime, and Mr. Daniluk was aware that that was a problem.
And would you agree that because President Zelensky is worried about this, they understood at least that there was some pressure for them to pursue these investigations? Is that fair?
Mr. Daniluk indicated that President Zelensky certainly understood it, that he did not want to get involved in these type of activities.
The next day, Ambassador Taylor relayed the Ukrainian leader's concerns to Volker and Sondland. But Ambassador Sondland did not back down. Specifically, Ambassador Sondland texted in response to Ambassador Taylor's worry. Absolutely, but we need to get the conversation started and the relationship built, irrespective of the pretext. Again, Ambassador Sondland had his marching orders, and he was determined to carry them out. A call between President Trump and President Zelensky was scheduled for July 25th. Before the call, President Trump spoke to Sondland and reiterated his expectation that the Ukrainian leader would commit to the investigations. Ambassador Sondland subsequently contacted Ambassadors Volker and relayed the message to him. Volker then texted Zelensky's top aide with President Trump's instructions. Assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down the date for a visit to Washington. Senators, in other words, even before the July 25th phone call with President Zelensky, before it ever took place, Ukraine understood what it needed to initiate, that it needed to initiate the investigations into the debunked conspiracy theory about the 2016 election as a condition for President Zelensky, the newly elected Ukrainian president, to visit the White House. Ambassador Sondland testified that acting on President Trump's direct orders, he and Ambassador Volker prepped President Zelensky for the telephone call.
And you would agree that the message in this that is expressed here is that President Zelensky needs to convince Trump that he will do the investigations in order to nail down the date for a visit to Washington, D.C. Is that correct?
That's correct.
By this time, nonpartisan career officials involved with Ukraine policy had become aware of this quid pro quo. Here is what 3 of them said during their testimony. Ambassador Taylor, the meeting President Zelensky wanted was conditioned on investigations of Burisma and alleged Ukrainian influence in the 2016 elections. Ambassador David Holmes, it was made clear that some action on a Burisma-Biden investigation was a precondition for an Oval Office visit. Dr. Hill, there seems to be an awful lot of people involved. You know, basically turning a White House meeting into some kind of asset that was dangled out to the Ukrainian government. A White House visit, a visit to the Oval Office dangled out to the Ukrainian government. Senators, I ask you to think about those words as we decide, as you decide, what action you will take. Think about those words. There was no doubt the direction came from the President of the United States. The President was the center of this scheme. Ambassador Sondland testified that Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew these investigations were important to the President. Ambassador Sondland added that Mr. Giuliani followed the direction of the President, and we followed the President's orders. However, as Ambassador Taylor testified, Ambassador Bolton was not interested in did not want to have the call because he thought it was going to be a disaster. He thought that there could be some talk of investigations or even worse than that. He thought, what was Ambassador, I ask you today, Senators, what was Ambassador Bolton so afraid that President Trump would say to the newly elected Ukrainian president? What was the National Security Advisor so afraid that President Trump would say to President Zelensky? And this is another topic we'd like to ask Ambassador Bolton about if and when he appears before this body.
Mr. Chief Justice, distinguished members of the Senate, I thank you once again for your indulgence and for your courtesy. as we all undertake our solemn constitutional responsibilities during this Senate trial. George Washington once observed in his farewell address to the nation that the Constitution is sacredly obligatory upon all. That means everyone. And in fact, that is what makes our great country so distinct from authoritarian regimes and enemies of democracy. Vladimir Putin is above the law in Russia. Erdogan is above the law in Turkey. Kim Jong-un is above the law in North Korea. But in the United States of America, no one is above the law, not even the President of the United States. That is what this moment is all about. As we all know, Congress is a separate and co-equal branch of government. We don't work for this president or any president. We, of course, work for the American people. We have a constitutional responsibility to serve as a check and balance on an out-of-control executive branch. That is not the Democratic Party playbook. That is not the Republican Party playbook. That is the playbook in a democratic republic. James Madison once observed in Federalist 51 that the Congress should serve as a rival to the executive branch. In my humble opinion, why would Madison use the word rival? It's because the framers of the Constitution, I think, did not want a king. They did not want a dictator. They did not want a monarch. They wanted a democracy. The Constitution is sacredly obligatory upon all. It is through that lens that we proceed today. For the next few moments, I would like to discuss President Trump's July 25th phone call with Ukraine's newly elected leader. The president claims that his call was perfect. Nothing can be further from the truth. The call is direct evidence of President Trump's solicitation of foreign interference in the 2020 election as part of a corrupt scheme. It is important, of course, to remember the context of this call. The new Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, was in a vulnerable position and viewed American and diplomatic military support as critical to his standing and to Ukraine's fragile future as a democracy. Equally significant, as outlined by my colleagues, America has a strong national security interest in supporting Ukraine against Russia's continued aggression. William Taylor, West Point graduate, Vietnam War hero, ambassador to Ukraine, appointed by Donald Trump, testified, Ukraine is a strategic partner of the United States, important for the security of our country as well as Europe. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, National Security Council officer, Trump appointee, Purple Heart recipient, Iraq War veteran, testified a strong and independent Ukraine is critical to our national security interests. Ukraine remains under attack by Russian-backed separatists in Crimea. It is an ongoing hot war. Ukraine is a friend, Russia is a foe. Ukraine is a democracy, Russia is a dictatorship. The United States may very well be one of the only things standing between Russia and Ukraine being completely overrun as part of Vladimir Putin's continued aggression against the free world. That is why this Congress allocated $391 million in military and security aid to a vulnerable Ukraine on a bipartisan basis, because it is in America's national security interests. On the July 25th call, Mr. Trump could have endeavored to strengthen the relationship with this new Ukrainian leader. Instead, President Trump focused on securing a personal favor. He wanted Ukraine to conduct phony investigations designed to enhance his political standing and solicit foreign interference in the 2020 election. On a July 25th call, President Trump maligned a highly respected American ambassador known as an anti-corruption crusader. At the same time, he praised a corrupt former Ukrainian prosecutor. And on multiple occasions, President Trump directed Ukraine's new leader to speak with his personal lawyer, Rudolph Giuliani, on an official call. Mr. Giuliani is not a member of the Trump administration. For these and other reasons, the July 25th call warrants our close scrutiny. It presents significant and shocking evidence of President Trump's corrupt intent. The call lays bare the president's willingness to do whatever it takes to get what he wants, even if his behavior undermines the national security interests of the United States of America. At the beginning of the call, President Zelensky mentioned U.S. military aid, and he states, "I would also like to thank you for your great support in the area of defense." The great support in the area of defense includes the security assistance passed by this Congress on a bipartisan basis that Donald Trump held up in violation of the law. Immediately after President Zelensky raised the issue of defense support, President Trump responded, "I would like you to do us a favor, though." These words will live in infamy. First, President Trump said to President Zelensky, as part of the two demands that he requested, "I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation in Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people, the server, they say, Ukraine has it." President Trump continued, "I would like to have the Attorney General call you or your people, and I would like you to get to the bottom of it. As you saw yesterday, that whole nonsense ended with a very poor performance by a man named Robert Mueller, a Vietnam War hero, by the way. A very poor performance by a man named Robert Mueller, an incompetent performance. But they say a lot of it started with Ukraine. Whatever you can do, it's very important that you do it if that's possible." Who is the they referred to by President Trump, putting forth the baseless conspiracy theory that the Ukrainians, not the Russians, were behind the hack of the Democratic National Committee server in 2016? They means Russia. They means Putin. They are enemies of the United States. Not a single witness who testified before the House knew of any factual basis for President Trump's belief in the CrowdStrike Ukraine fairy tale. To the contrary, the U.S. intelligence community and this Senate Intelligence Committee assessed that Russia interfered in the 2016 election. As Dr. Fiona Hill testified, the theory that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election is, quote, a fictional narrative that has been perpetrated and propagated by the Russian security services. The conspiracy theory that President Trump advanced on the July 25th phone call is stone-cold Russian propaganda. As early as February 2017, Vladimir Putin began to promote this lie during a press conference, saying, quote, the Ukrainian government adopted a unilateral position in favor of one candidate. More than that, certain oligarchs, certainly with the approval of the political leadership, funded this candidate, or female candidate, to be precise. Those are the words of Vladimir Putin, a script apparently adopted by President Donald John Trump. If there was any doubt about who benefits from this unfounded, Russian-inspired conspiracy theory advanced by Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin made it clear when he said in November of 2019, thank God no one is accusing us anymore of interfering in U.S. elections. Now they're accusing Ukrainians. Unfortunately, this is not the first time President Trump tried to capitalize on Russian propaganda and misinformation for his own political benefit. On July 24th, just one day before this call, Special Counsel Robert Mueller testified before Congress that the Russian government interfered in the 2016 election in sweeping and systematic fashion in order to support the Trump campaign and divide America. Mr. Mueller also found that the Trump campaign welcomed Russian interference in the 2016 election and utilized it as part of its campaign messaging. Despite the clear and overwhelming conclusion of U.S. intelligence agencies, as well as the distinguished Senate Intelligence Committee, that Russia, not Ukraine, interfered in the 2016 election, President Trump continued to press the new Ukrainian leader to announce an investigation into the CrowdStrike Ukraine conspiracy theory. Why? President Trump sought a political favor. That's why. As part of a scheme to solicit foreign interference in the 2020 election. The second demand made by President Trump on the July 25th call related to the campaign of Vice President Joe Biden, who announced his intention to run for the office of the presidency last April. Throughout the spring and early summer of last year, public polling consistently showed that Biden would decisively defeat President Trump. In fact, on June 16th of last year, June 16th, a Fox News poll showed that President Trump would lose to Joe Biden by 10 points. The concern with Joe Biden's candidacy provides motive for President Trump's demand that the Ukrainian government investigate the former vice president and his son, Hunter. Here is what President Trump said on that call. The other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution. And a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution. So if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me. Now, the Trump administration officials who participated in the impeachment inquiry unanimously testified that there was no factual support for the allegation that Vice President Biden did anything wrong or misused his authority when he pressed for the removal of Ukraine's corrupt former prosecutor general. Joe Biden did nothing wrong. The witnesses testified that Vice President Biden was in fact carrying out official U.S. policy to clean up the Prosecutor General's office in Ukraine. This policy, of course, aligned with the perspective of many in this very distinguished body, as well as our European allies throughout the world, as well as the International Monetary Fund. Vice President Biden did not remove Yuri Lutsenko, the corrupt prosecutor. The Ukrainian government did, with the support of the free world. Nonetheless, on October 3rd, 2019, when a reporter asked President Trump, "What exactly did you hope Zelensky would do about the Bidens after your phone call?" President Trump responded as follows.
Mr. President, what exactly did you hope Zelensky would do about the Bidens after your phone call? Exactly.
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer.
Start a major investigation into the Bidens. The evidence of wrongdoing by President Trump is hiding in plain sight. During the July 25th call, President Trump also repeatedly pressed the Ukrainian president to coordinate with his personal attorney, Rudolph Giuliani. Why was Rudolph Giuliani's name mentioned multiple times during the July 25th phone call? Giuliani is not the Secretary of State. He's not an ambassador. He's not a member of the diplomatic corps. Rudolph Giuliani is a cold-blooded political operative for President Trump's re-election campaign. That is why he was referenced multiple times on that July 25th phone call. And it is evidence of corrupt intent by President Trump. By the time the call took place, President Zelensky understood Giuliani's connection to the shakedown scheme. He recognized Giuliani's role as the president's political operative as matters related to Ukraine. Zelensky informed President Trump that one of his aides spoke with Mr. Giuliani just recently, and we are hoping very much that Mr. Giuliani will be able to travel to Ukraine and we will meet once he comes. The Ukrainian leader knew Giuliani represented President Trump's political interest in his country and could help unlock the long sought after Oval Office meeting that President Zelensky desired. The phony investigations sought by President Trump on the July 25th call were not designed to bolster the national security interests of the United States of America. Quite the contrary, President Trump sought to benefit himself and his own reelection prospects. On the July 25th call, President Trump also suggested that President Zelensky speak with the Attorney General, William Barr, about the two fake investigations that the president sought. This is important to keep in mind. At no time during this entire sordid scheme was there an ongoing American law enforcement investigation into the phony slander related to Joe Biden or the conspiracy theory related to Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election. At no time was there an ongoing American law enforcement investigation. America is the leader of the free world. We do not urge other sovereign countries to target American citizens, absent any legitimate basis whatsoever, absent any scintilla of evidence. Apparently, President Trump does not play by those rules. During the July 25th call, President Trump didn't raise legitimate corruption concerns as it relates to Ukraine. President Trump did not mention the word corruption once. The president did, however, viciously malign former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, a distinguished anti-corruption advocate whom he abruptly removed because she was seen as an obstacle to his geopolitical shakedown. Ambassador Yovanovitch joined the diplomatic corps under President Ronald Reagan and subsequently served 3 other Republican presidents. She is a highly respected diplomat and foreign service professional. Yet, President Trump told the new Ukrainian leader, the former ambassador from the United States, the woman, was bad news, and the people she was dealing with in the Ukraine were bad news. So I just want to let you know that. He didn't stop there. Later in the call, President Trump ominously added, well, she's going to go through some things. These are the words of the President of the United States of America. Ambassador Yovanovitch did not know of President Trump's disparaging remarks at the time. She didn't learn of them until the call record became public in September. Asked whether she felt threatened by President Trump's statement that she was going to go through some things, Ambassador Yovanovitch answered that she did. Here is what she said.
The next excerpt, when the president references you, is a short one, but he said, well, she's going to go through some things. What did you think when President Trump told President Zelensky, and you read, that you were going to go through some things?
I didn't know what to think, but I was very concerned.
What were you concerned about?
She's going to go through some things. It didn't sound good. It sounded like a threat.
Did you feel threatened?
I did.
During that same call, President Trump also took the opportunity to praise Yuri Lutsenko. Mr. Lutsenko is the former Ukrainian prosecutor general who was widely regarded by the entire free world, including our European allies and the International Monetary Fund, to be corrupt and incompetent. But Donald John Trump, our president, praised him on that call. He told President Zelensky, quote, "I heard you had a prosecutor who was very good, and he was shut down, and that's really unfair." A lot of people are talking about that, the way they shut your very good prosecutor down. And you had some very bad people involved. Think about this contrast. The president bashed a career American diplomat, an anti-corruption champion, who he unceremoniously removed because she was viewed as an obstacle to his efforts to solicit foreign interference in the 2020 election, and at the same time, praised someone who he thought could be an asset, a corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor, who the free world viewed as an obstacle to the rule of law. The idea that President Trump cares about corruption is laughable. It's laughable. Plain reading of the rough transcript of the July 25th call also sheds light on the quid pro quo involving the Oval Office meeting that had been sought. President Zelensky said on the call, "I also wanted to thank you for your invitation to visit the United States, specifically Washington, D.C. On the other hand, I also wanted to ensure that we will be very serious about the case and will work on the investigation." As all of you know, here in this distinguished body, quid pro quo is a Latin term. It means this for that. Statement that I just read shows that President Zelensky fully understood at the time of this July 25th call that if he yielded to President Trump's demand for phony investigations, he would get the White House meeting in the Oval Office that he desperately sought. This for that. President Trump has repeatedly insisted that his July 25th conversation with President Zelensky was a perfect call. His staff at the White House apparently believed otherwise. The press office issued a short and incomplete summary of the July 25th call. Let me read it for your hearing. Today, President Donald J. Trump spoke by telephone with President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine to congratulate him on his recent
The Senate will be in order. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery.
And the scripture says, "For the Lord loves justice and will not abandon his faithful ones." Official White House call readout, July 25th, 2019. Today, President Donald J. Trump spoke by telephone with President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine to congratulate him on his recent election. President Trump and President Zelensky discussed ways to strengthen the relationship between the United States and Ukraine, including energy and economic cooperation. Both leaders also expressed that they look forward to the opportunity to meet. That is the official White House call readout dated July 25th, 2019. The official readout provided to the American people omitted key elements of the president's conversation. Let's review. The official readout did not mention the phony investigations requested by President Trump. The official readout did not mention the Oval Office meeting sought by President Zelensky. The official readout did not mention President Trump's elevation of a debunked conspiracy theory promoted by Vladimir Putin about 2016 election interference. The official readout did not mention President Trump's demand that Ukraine investigate his domestic political rival, Joe Biden. The official readout did not mention that President Trump maligned and threatened Ambassador Yovanovitch. And the official readout did not mention that President Trump praised a corrupt former Ukrainian prosecutor. The complete conversation, however, between President Trump and President Zelensky that we just outlined offers powerful evidence that President Trump abused his power and solicited foreign interference in the 2016 election, the 2020 election. Several members of the president's staff listening in on the call immediately grew concerned. As he sat in the White House Situation Room listening to the conversation, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman realized that the president's demands of the Ukrainian leader were inappropriate and improper. He quickly recognized that as the president began referencing the Bidens and CrowdStrike, the call was diverging from the official National Security Council approved talking points that he helped prepare. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, 20-year Iraq War veteran, Purple Heart recipient, and American patriot. He testified in the context of the call that due to the unequal bargaining position of the two leaders and Ukraine's dependence on the United States, the favor that President Trump sought would have been perceived by President Zelensky as a demand. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman worried that the call would undermine U.S. national security interests, and he knew immediately that he had a duty to report the contents of the call to White House lawyers.
I was concerned by the call. What I heard was inappropriate, and I reported my concerns to Mr. Eisenberg. It is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen and a political opponent. I was also clear that if Ukraine pursued an investigation, it was also clear that if Ukraine pursued an investigation into the 2016 elections, the Bidens and Burisma, it would be interpreted as a partisan play. This would undoubtedly result in Ukraine losing bipartisan support, undermining U.S. national security, and advancing Russia's strategic objectives in the region.
Recounting the content of the call based on his detailed handwritten notes, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman told the lawyers that he believed it was wrong for President Trump to ask President Zelensky to investigate Vice President Biden. Other witnesses were also troubled by what they heard. Vice President Pence's advisor, Jennifer Williams, expressed concern that President Trump raised a domestic political matter on an official call with a foreign leader. She testified that the mention of investigations struck her as unusual and possibly political in nature. She said, "I guess for me, it shed some light on possible other motives behind a security assistance hold." Timothy Morrison, a former Republican congressional staffer who replaced Dr. Fiona Hill in July of 2019, also reported the call to National Security Council lawyers. After the call, President Trump continued to push the scheme forward. On July 26, the very next day, Ambassador Sondland and Ambassador Taylor met with President Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials in Kyiv. According to David Holmes, the Ukraine-based U.S. diplomat who served as the note-taker, the Ukrainian leader mentioned that President Trump had brought up some very sensitive issues during the July 25th call. Very sensitive issues. Ambassador Sondland then had a private meeting with Andrei Yermak, President Zelensky's top aide. The two men insisted that the meeting be one-on-one with no note-taker, perhaps due to the sensitive issues that might come up. Ambassador Sondland testified that he and President Zelensky's aide probably discussed the issue of investigations. After these key moments in Ukraine, Ambassador Sondland went to lunch with David Holmes and two other American officials. Mr. Holmes sat directly across from Ambassador Sondland, close enough to hear the details of an extraordinary telephone call between Mr. Sondland and President Trump. As Mr. Holmes relayed during his sworn testimony under oath, Ambassador Sondland pulled out his unsecured cell phone and said that he was going to call President Trump to give him an update. What happened next was shocking.
While Ambassador Sondland's phone was not on speakerphone, I could hear the president's voice through the earpiece of the phone. The president's voice was loud and recognizable. And Ambassador Sondland held the phone away from his ear for a period of time, presumably because of the loud volume. I heard Ambassador Sondland greet the president and explain he was calling from Kyiv. I heard President Trump then clarify that Ambassador Sondland was in Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland replied, yes, he was in Ukraine, and went on to state that President Zelensky, quote, loves her ass. I then heard President Trump ask, so he's going to do the investigation. Ambassador Sondland replied that he's going to do it, adding that President Zelensky will do anything you ask him to do.
He's going to do it. He will do anything you ask him to do. Immediately after this call with President Trump, Mr. Holmes followed up with Ambassador Sondland.
After the call ended, Ambassador Sondland remarked that the president was in a bad mood. As Ambassador Sondland stated, it was often the case early in the morning. I then took the opportunity to ask Ambassador Sondland for his candid impression of the president's views on Ukraine. In particular, I asked Ambassador Sondland if it was true that the president did not give an expletive about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland agreed that the president did not give an expletive about Ukraine. I asked why not. And Ambassador Sondland stated that the president only cares about big stuff. I noted there was big stuff going on in Ukraine, like a war with Russia. And Ambassador Sondland replied that he meant big stuff that benefits the president, like the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani was pushing. The conversation then moved on to other topics.
During the July 25th call, President Trump asked for the favor of these two phony political investigations immediately after the Ukrainian president brought up defense assistance for Ukraine. And the following day, Ambassador Sondland confirmed to President Trump that Ukraine would indeed initiate the investigations discussed on the call, which was the only thing President cared about with respect to Ukraine. He didn't care that Russia was forcefully occupying eastern Ukraine. President Trump didn't care that thousands of Ukrainians apparently have died fighting for their democracy. He didn't seem to care that supporting Ukraine bolsters America's national security. But he cared about himself as it relates to the prospects of his reelection in 2020. In November, President Trump denied that he spoke to Ambassador Sondland on July 26, telling reporters, "I know nothing about that." But in his public testimony, Ambassador Sondland contradicted that assertion with official records he obtained from the White House. Ambassador Sondland further explained that Holmes's testimony refreshed his reelection about the July 26 call, which Ambassador Sondland had not originally described when he first appeared at a deposition before the House.
Also, on July 26, shortly after our Kiev meetings, I spoke by phone with President Trump. The White House, which has finally shared certain call dates and times with my attorneys, confirms this. The call lasted 5 minutes. I remember I was at a restaurant in Kiev, and I have no reason to doubt that this conversation included the subject of investigations. Again, given Mr. Giuliani's demand that President Zelensky make a public statement about investigations, I knew that investigations were important to President Trump.
President Trump said that his July 25th conversation was a perfect call. It was far from perfect. In a perfect call, the president would not demand a political favor from a vulnerable Ukraine under attack by a Russian foe. In a perfect call, the president would not demand that a foreign leader investigate a Russian-inspired conspiracy about the 2016 election. In a perfect call, the president would not pressure a foreign government to target an American citizen for political personal gain. In a perfect call, the president would not solicit foreign interference in the 2020 election. In a perfect call, the president would not threaten the well-being of a highly respected American ambassador and say that she was going to go through some things. In a perfect call, the president would not praise a disgraced former prosecutor who the free world viewed as corrupt and incompetent. And in a perfect call, the president would not have directed a foreign leader to follow up with Rudolph Giuliani, a human hand grenade. This was not a perfect call. It is direct evidence that President Donald John Trump corruptly abused his power and solicited foreign interference in the 2020 election.
The majority leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, colleagues, we'll now take a 30-minute break for dinner and reconvene at 5 minutes after 7. So I ask consent the Senate stand in recess until that time.
Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. Just so senators have an idea of the evening, we expect to go about 2 to 2.5 hours. I'll make a presentation. Representative Lofgren from California will make a presentation. I'll make a final presentation, and then we will be done for the evening. As an encouraging voice told me, keep it up, but don't keep it up too long. So we will do our best not to keep it up too long. I'm going to turn now to the part of the chronology that picks up right after that July 25th call and walk through the increasingly explicit pressure campaign waged on Ukraine in order to get President Trump's deliverable, the investigations meant to tarnish his opponent and help his reelection. Now remember, by the end of July, Ukraine was aware of President Trump's requests for investigation to help his political efforts and had come to know that President Trump put a freeze on security assistance. So this is by the end of July. They also clearly understood that President Trump was withholding an Oval Office meeting until those investigations were announced. Both were very critical to Ukraine as a sign of U.S. support and as a matter of their national security. And their national security, of course, implicates our national security. In the weeks after the July 25th call, President Trump's handpicked representatives escalated their efforts to get the public announcement of the investigations from Ukraine. So let's go through this step by step, because the 3 weeks following the July 25th call tell so much about this pressure scheme. Let's start with July 26. On July 26, so this is the day after the call, Ambassador Volker sends a text message to Giuliani. And that text message says, "Hi, Mr. Mayor. You may have heard the president had a great call with Ukrainian president yesterday. Exactly the right messages as we discussed. Please send dates when you will be in Madrid. I am seeing Yermak tomorrow morning. He will come to you in Madrid. Thanks for your help, Kurt." So here we are the day after that call. As my colleague demonstrates, this same day, so July 26th, the date of that second infamous call between President Trump this time and Gordon Sondland that you heard the diplomat David Holmes describe. So that's same day, July 26th, that we're talking about right now, where there's this text message. Now, of course, in that July 25th call, the president wants to connect Rudy Giuliani with the president of Ukraine and his people. And so this is a follow-up where Ambassador Volker is saying to Giuliani, it was a great call with Ukraine president, exactly the right messages as we discussed. And we know, of course, those messages were the need to do this political investigation. Please send dates when you'll be in Madrid. I'm seeing Yermak tomorrow morning. He will come to you in Madrid. So here is Ambassador Volker, one of the three amigos, following up, arranging this meeting between Giuliani and the Ukrainians. Giuliani replied, setting a meeting in Europe with President Zelensky's top aide for the very next week. Quote, "I will arrive on August 1 and until 5, he wrote. Now remember, on July 22nd, so a few days before this and before the call, Ambassador Volker had connected Giuliani originally with Yermak, and they agreed to meet. So this is a follow-up. You have that arrangement being made by Volker and Giuliani before the call, then you have the call, and now you have the follow-up to arrange the meeting in Madrid. And so they do meet in Madrid. This is August 2nd. Andrei Yermak, Zelensky's top aide, flew to Madrid, meets with Rudy Giuliani, who they know represented the president's interests. Both Giuliani and Yermak walk away from this meeting in Madrid, clearly understanding that a White House meeting is linked to Zelensky's announcement of the investigations. In separate conversations with Giuliani and Yermak after this Madrid meeting, Volker said he learned that Giuliani wanted the Ukrainians to issue a statement, including specific mentions of the two investigations that the president wanted. According to Ambassador Volker's testimony, Yermak told him that his meeting with Giuliani was very good and immediately added that the Ukrainians asked for a White House meeting during the week of September 16th. Yermak presses Volker on the White House meeting date, saying that he was waiting for confirmation. Maybe you know the date. And this is a recurrent theme that we've seen through the text messages and other documents, and that is the recurrent request for this meeting, the pressing for this meeting by the Ukrainians because it was so important to them. Giuliani's objective was clear to Ambassadors Volker and Sondland, who took over communications with Yermak. Here's Ambassador Sondland.
I first communicated with Mr. Giuliani in early August, several months later. Mr. Giuliani emphasized that the president wanted a public statement from President Zelensky committing Ukraine to look into the corruption issues. Mr. Giuliani specifically mentioned the 2016 election, including the DNC server, and Burisma as two topics of importance to the president.
Giuliani exerted significant influence in this process. In fact, when on August 4th, Yermak inquired again about the presidential meeting, Ambassador Volker turned not to the National Security Council staff or to the State Department to arrange it and follow up. He turns to Giuliani again. Volker told Yermak that he would speak with Giuliani later that day and would call the Ukrainian president's aide afterward. Volker then texts Giuliani to ask about the Madrid meeting and to set up the call that he had mentioned to Yermak. Giuliani replies that the meeting with Yermak was excellent and that he would call later. Phone records obtained by the committees show a 16-minute call on August 5th between Ambassador Volker and Giuliani. Ambassador Volker then texts Yermak, "Hi, Andre. Had a good long talk with Rudy. Call anytime. Kurt." Separately, Volker told Ambassador Sondland, Giuliani was happy with that meeting and it looks like things are turning around. A reference to Volker's hope that satisfying Giuliani would break down President Trump's reservations concerning Ukraine. But things had not turned around by the end of that first week of August, by August 7th. The aid was still on hold, and there had been no movement on setting a date for the White House meeting. Ambassador Volker then reaches out to Giuliani to try to get things moving. Ambassador Volker texts Giuliani to recommend that he report to the boss, meaning President Trump, about his meeting with Yermak in Madrid. Specifically, he wrote, this is Volker writing to Giuliani, "Hi, Rudy. Hope you made it back safely. Let's meet if you're coming to D.C., and would be good if you could convey results of your meeting in Madrid to the boss so we can get a firm date for the visit." So this is Ambassador Volker following up Giuliani. Giuliani's met with the top aide to the president of Ukraine in Madrid, and he wants Giuliani to convey to the boss, to Trump, how good that meeting in Madrid was about the investigations so they can get the president of Ukraine in the door at the White House. Now, think about how unusual this is. This is the president's personal lawyer who's on this personal mission on behalf of his client to get these investigations in Ukraine. The president of Ukraine can't get in the door of the Oval Office. And who are they going to? Are they going to the Security Council? No. Are they going to the State Department? No. They tried all that. They're going to the president's personal lawyer. Does that sound like an official policy to try to fight corruption? Why would you go outside of the normal channel to do that? You wouldn't. No, you go to your personal attorney who's on a personal mission that he admits is not foreign policy when your objective has nothing to do with policy. When your objective is a corrupt one. Now, what does that mean, to have a corrupt objective? Well, it means an illicit one. It means an impermissible one. It means one that furthers your own interest at the cost of the national interest. The willingness to break the law, like the Impoundment Control Act, by withholding aid, is indicative of that corrupt purpose, the lengths the president would go, not in furtherance of U.S. policy, but against U.S. policy. Not even a difference on policy at all. The mere pursuit of personal interest, the pursuit of an illegal effort to get foreign interference is the very embodiment of a corrupt intent. So here we are, August 7th. And Volker is saying, Rudy, if you're coming to D.C., let's get together. It'd be good if you can talk to the boss, because we can't get a meeting other way. Around that time, Ambassador Volker received a text message from Yermak, who asked him, and this is Yermak asking Volker, "Hi, Kurt, how are you? Do you have some news about the White House meeting date?" And Volker responds, "Not yet. I texted Rudy earlier to make sure he weighs in following your meeting. Gordon," meaning Sondland, "should be speaking with the president on Friday. We are pressing this." So there it is. Gordon Sondland is pressing this. This is the man you've heard from already, Gordon Sondland, the man who says there was absolutely a quid pro quo. You've asked about a quid pro quo. There was a quid pro quo about this White House meeting. This is what they're talking about right here. Gordon will be speaking with the president on Friday. We are pressing this. Ambassador Volker's contact with Giuliani spurred a flurry of communications. The patterns of calls from August 8th strongly suggest Giuliani's attempting to call the White House to speak to a senior White House official, left a message, then had a 4-minute call with that official later that night. We don't know from the call records who that White House official was, but recall that Giuliani has publicly stated that when he spoke to the White House, he usually spoke to President Trump, his client. Also on August 8th, Yermak texts Volker that he had some news. Ambassador Volker replies that he can talk then, and Ambassador Volker updates Giuliani in a text the next day. Volker says to Giuliani in the text, "Hi, Mr. Mayor, I had a good chat with Yermak last night. He was pleased with your phone call. Mentioned," he's referring to President Zelensky here, "making a statement. Can we all get on the phone to make sure I advise," and here he's referring to President Zelensky, "correctly as to what he should be saying. Want to make sure we get this done right." So here, August 9th, there's an effort by Volker to make sure that they get the statement right about the investigations. Because if they can't get the statement right, he ain't going to get in the door of the Oval Office. It also makes clear who is exactly in charge of this, and that's Rudy Giuliani. Ambassador Volker is checking with Rudy Giuliani about what he should advise President Zelensky. And we know that Giuliani is taking his orders from President Trump. Text messages and call records obtained by the committees show that Ambassador Volker and Giuliani connected by phone twice around noon on August 9th for several minutes each. Following the calls with Giuliani, Ambassador Volker created a 3-way group chat using WhatsApp that included himself, Ambassador Sondland, and Yermak. Ambassador Volker initiated the chat around 2:20 that day. And this is Volker chatting with Sondland and Yermak. It's a 3-way chat. And Volker says, "Hi, Andre," meaning Yermak. "We have all consulted here, including with Rudy. Could you do a call later today or tomorrow, your afternoon time?" And Sondland says, "I have a call scheduled at 3 p.m. Eastern for the 3 of us. Ops will call." Call records obtained by the committee show that on August 9th, Ambassador Sondland twice connected with phone lines associated with the White House. Once in the early afternoon for about 18 minutes and once in the late afternoon for about 2 minutes. We know that Ambassador Sondland had direct access to President Trump. After all this activity, Ambassador Sondland and Volker thought they had a breakthrough. Finally, a breakthrough. Minutes after this call, which was likely with Tim Morrison about a possible date for the White House meeting, Ambassador Volker and Sondland discussed the agreement they believed they'd reached. And starts with Sondland in this text message. "Morrison ready to get dates as soon as Yermak confirms." Volker says, "Excellent. How did you sway him?" "Not sure I did," says Sondland. "I think POTUS really wants the deliverable." Well, we know what that deliverable is. It's the political investigations. Volker says, "But does he know that?" And Sondland says, "Yep. Clearly lots of convos, meaning conversations, going on." And Volker says, "Okay, then that's good. It's coming from 2 separate sources." Ambassador Sondland told the committees that the deliverable required by President Trump was a press statement from President Zelensky, committing to do the investigations into the Bidens and the allegation of Ukraine election interference that President Trump mentioned on July 25th. But Tim Morrison testified that he didn't know anything about the deliverable. He was just involved in trying to schedule the White House meeting, which everyone wanted to schedule as a sign of support for President Zelensky and our ally Ukraine. But Trump's agents wouldn't just accept Ukraine's word for it. Ambassador Sondland then recommended to Ambassador Volker that Yermak share a draft of the press statement to ensure that the statement would comport with the president's expectations. So here on August 9th, so we're still less than 2 weeks after the July 25th call, or we're about 2 weeks. Sondland says in this message, to avoid misunderstandings, might be helpful to ask Andre for a draft statement, parentheses embargoed, so that we can see exactly what they propose to cover. Even though Z, referring to Zelensky, does a live presser, they can still summarize in a brief statement. Thoughts? And Volker says, agree. At his deposition, Ambassador Sondland said that he suggested reviewing a written summary of the statement because he was concerned that President Zelensky would say whatever he would say on live television and it still wouldn't be good enough for Rudy / the president, unquote. Yermak, in turn, was concerned that the announcement would still not result in the coveted White House meeting. On August 10th, Yermak texted Volker attempting to schedule a White House meeting before the Ukrainian president made a public statement in support of the investigations into Burisma and the 2016 election. So you can see what's going on here. The president and his agent, Giuliani, they want this public statement of the investigations before they'll give a date. And the Ukrainians want a date before they have to commit to making public they're going to do the investigations. And so you've had this standoff where each is trying to get the deliverable first. But there's no debate about what the deliverable is on either side. There's no debate about the quid pro quo here. You give me this, I'll give you that. You give me the White House meeting, I'll give you the public announcement, the investigation into your political rival. No, no, no. You give me the announcement of the investigation into my rival, and then I'll give you the meeting. The only debate here is about which comes first. So August 10th, Yermak texts Volker, I think it's possible to make this declaration and mention all these things which we discussed yesterday, but it will be logic to do after we receive a confirmation of date. We inform about date of visit, about our expectations and our guarantees for future visit. Let's discuss it. Ambassador Volker responded that he agreed, but that first they would have to iron out a statement and use that to get a date, after which President Zelensky would give the statement. The two decided to have a call the next day and to include Ambassador Sondland. Yermak texts Ambassador Volker, excellent. Once we have a date, we will call for a press briefing announcing upcoming visit and outlining vision for the reboot of U.S.-Ukraine relationship, including, among other things, Burisma and election meddling in the investigations. Yermak was also in direct contact with Ambassador Sondland regarding this revised approach. In fact, he sent Ambassador Sondland the same text message. Ambassador Sondland kept the leadership of the State Department in the loop. On August 10th, he told Ambassador Volker that he had reported to Ulrich Breckbull, Counselor of the Department